What happens when an undercover CEO steps into his own failing ambulance service? Daniel Hayes, the CEO of Guardian Response Services, had built his company on the promise of quick, reliable emergency care. But lately, that promise had been falling apart. Reports of delayed response times, malfunctioning equipment, and exhausted staff had been piling up. Complaints from patients who had to wait too long for an ambulance, and first responders quitting due to impossible workloads, painted a troubling picture of a company more focused on cost-cutting than saving lives. Sitting in his corner office, Daniel flipped through yet another incident report. A cardiac arrest victim had died because an ambulance took 27 minutes to arrive, even though it should have been there in 10. The data showed a pattern. The company was prioritizing VIP clients and wealthier neighborhoods, while low-income areas were left waiting dangerously long for emergency care. The worst part? His executives dismissed the concerns. Todd Reynolds, the operations director, shrugged off the numbers, saying, "We have to make tough calls, Daniel. We can't afford to be everywhere at once." Meanwhile, Cynthia Brooks, the CFO, insisted the company was more profitable than ever, arguing that we're running an efficient business, not a charity. But Daniel knew that wasn't right. Guardian Response had been founded to serve the community, not just paid its bottom line. If the boardroom wasn't taking the issue seriously, he would find out for himself. He needed the truth, not sugar-coated reports. That's when he made his decision. He would go undercover. With a fake identity, a shaved beard, and a new name, Jake Carter, he would pose as a rookie EMT assigned to one of the most problematic ambulance stations, Station 14. No VIP treatment, no boardroom meetings, just a first-hand look at what his employees and patients were truly facing. As he grabbed his old EMT uniform and looked in the mirror, Daniel wondered, had Guardian Response lost its way? Or had he lost sight of what truly mattered? He was about to find out. Daniel, now Jake Carter, rookie EMT, stepped into Station 14 just before sunrise, the air thick with the smell of coffee, sweat, and stale fast food. The building itself looked worn down, with cracked tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and outdated equipment stacked in corners. He expected at least a basic orientation, maybe a senior EMT offering guidance, but instead he got barely a glance from the others. A burly man with graying hair and tired eyes leaned against the counter, sipping coffee. His name tag read Grady Lewis, lead paramedic. He squinted at Jake. "You the new guy?" Jake nodded. "Yeah, just transferred." Grady let out a dry chuckle. "Welcome to hell." That set the tone for the day. The ambulance rigs were outdated, some barely meeting safety standards. Vital equipment was missing or malfunctioning, from defibrillators with low battery warnings to stretchers with broken locks. A few of the paramedics joked about it, but underneath their sarcasm, Jake could see frustration and exhaustion. His partner for the shift, Erin Matthews, a sharp-witted, no-nonsense EMT with 5 years under her belt, barely acknowledged him as she checked their gear. "Don't slow me down," she muttered. "We don't have time for hand-holding." The first call came in within minutes, a middle-aged man in respiratory distress. Jake jumped into the rig, adrenaline surging. This was why he had built this company, to save lives. But what followed shook him. As they arrived, the man's wife was in tears, pleading for help, but Erin barely spoke to her, focusing solely on loading the patient. The oxygen tank was half empty, forcing them to ration it until they reached the hospital. The patient's vitals were dropping, but the onboard cardiac monitor was malfunctioning, leaving them guessing. They made it to the hospital just in time, but as they wheeled the man inside, Erin shot Jake a knowing look. "This happens all the time. Get used to it." Jake's gut twisted. The cold efficiency of it all, the lack of resources, and the burnout among the crew. This wasn't what Guardian Response was supposed to be. His company had become everything he once swore it wouldn't. And the worst part, nobody here seemed surprised. By the end of his first week, Jake Carter, formerly Daniel Hayes, CEO, had seen enough to realize that Guardian Response was on the brink of collapse. Not financially. Cynthia Brooks, the CFO, had assured the board that profits were soaring. But morally, ethically, and operationally, the company was failing its most vital workers, the EMTs on the front lines. The ambulance crews were stretched thin. Calls came in back to back with little to no downtime between emergencies. Some paramedics were running on only 3 or 4 hours of sleep, others skipping meals entirely because there wasn't time to stop. Mental and physical exhaustion clung to every person in Station 14 like a second uniform. Jake's partner, Erin Matthews, was the perfect example. She was one of the best paramedics he had seen in action, making split-second decisions that saved lives, but she looked one bad shift away from complete burnout. One afternoon, between calls, Jake found her leaning against the rig, rubbing her temples. "You okay?" he asked. She let out a tired laugh. "Ask me that again after my 10th straight shift this week." Jake frowned. "You're on your 10th? "Yeah," she said, shaking her head. "Not because I want to be. We're short-staffed, so it's either take the extra shifts or let someone else suffer through a double. No real choice." And she wasn't the only one. Station 14 had EMTs running on fumes, many pulling 70, 80-hour weeks, juggling brutal schedules just to make ends meet. The worst part? Overtime wasn't even optional. The company relied on EMTs being overworked rather than hiring more staff, treating them as expendable resources instead of life-saving professionals. The lack of equipment made things worse. One night, they responded to a car crash where a young woman had suffered a severe head injury. As they worked to stabilize her, Jake realized they didn't have the right spinal support brace, just an outdated, ill-fitting one that barely did the job. They shouldn't have had to improvise with someone's life on the line. When Jake asked Grady about it later, the veteran paramedic just shrugged. "We put in requests all the time. Corporate either ignores them or tells us to make do." It hit Jake then. The company's success was built on the suffering of its workers. EMTs like Erin, Grady, and the rest of the crew were holding the system together through sheer willpower, but that couldn't last forever. Jake had built the Guardian response to save lives. Now he realized the first lives he had to save were the ones wearing the uniforms. Jake Carter had seen countless emergencies in just a few weeks, but nothing prepared him for the night that shattered what little faith he had left in Guardian Response's system. It was supposed to be a routine call, a distress alert from a small apartment complex on the east side of town. A 72-year-old man, William Hensley, was having severe chest pains, his daughter's frantic voice trembling through the dispatch line. They were already behind schedule. The station was down 2 units due to maintenance issues that had yet to be approved by corporate, leaving only a skeleton crew on duty. Jake and Erin had just finished a grueling back-to-back shift, their limbs aching from exhaustion, when the call came through. "What's the ETA?" Jake asked, as Erin floored the accelerator. "Dispatch is saying 10 minutes, she said, glancing at him, frustration written all over her face. "That's if nothing slows us down." But something did. Halfway there, they got rerouted. Another call had come in. A minor fender bender involving a politician's son. Dispatch, following orders from upper management, diverted them to the low-risk case instead, leaving William waiting alone, clutching his chest, gasping for air. "Are you kidding me?" Jake's grip on the radio tightened. "A car accident with no serious injuries take priority over a possible heart attack?" "It's above my pay grade," the dispatcher responded, voice tight with discomfort. "Orders from the top." By the time another unit was cleared to respond to William's call, it had been 32 minutes. When the paramedics arrived, he had collapsed in his living room, unresponsive. His daughter was inconsolable, screaming as they tried to revive him. It was too late. Jake and Erin arrived back at the station in silence, both too angry to speak. But Jake didn't stay silent for long. He stormed into the office where Marcus Hale, the regional director, sat behind his desk, sipping coffee like he hadn't just let a man die. "You knew," Jake growled, barely holding back his rage. "You knew we had a priority case, and you still sent us to a VIP call?" Marcus didn't even flinch. "That politician's family donates thousands to Guardian Response. Losing their support would cost us. And Mr. Hensley?" He shrugged. "People die every day, Carter. It's the job." Jake's fists clenched. "Not like this. Not because we chose the wrong call." Marcus scoffed. You're new, so I'll spell it out for you. The company needs money to run. The high-profile calls? They keep us funded. The lower-income cases? Sad, but they don't pay the bills. Something in Jake snapped. He had spent his entire career believing Guardian Response was about saving lives, but in that moment he realized, under this leadership, it was about saving profits, not people. That night, Jake didn't just feel like an undercover CEO anymore. He felt like a man who had let his own company become a monster, and it was time to fix it before more lives were lost. The morning after William Hensley's preventable death, Daniel Grayson was done playing along. He had stepped into Guardian Response's world as an undercover EMT to understand the dysfunction, but now he knew it was beyond broken. It was corrupt. People weren't just being left behind because of overworked staff or funding issues. They were being deliberately connected families and wealthy donors, and it had cost a man his life. Daniel walked into headquarters with a new sense of purpose. His uniform was the same, his badge still read Daniel Grant, EMT, but today, he wasn't just an employee. He was the CEO, and it was time everyone knew it. He marched straight into the central office, where Marcus Hale sat at his desk, reading through emails like he hadn't just dismissed a human life as an unfortunate statistic. Several other regional administrators were gathered in the conference room, sipping coffee and laughing, completely unaware that their world was about to change. Daniel dropped a thick folder onto the conference table with a heavy thud. The room went silent. "What's this?" Marcus asked, barely looking up. Daniel's voice was steady, but the anger simmered beneath it. "Evidence." The administrators glanced at each other, then at Marcus, who still seemed unbothered. Daniel continued, his tone unwavering. "Records of patient calls we ignored in favor of VIP cases. Financial statements showing exactly where our funding is really coming from. Wealthy donors who get exited care while low-income communities wait for hours. And worst of all, a list of names. People who should have been saved but weren't." Marcus's smirk finally faltered. "Where did you get this?" "I've been here long enough to see it with my own eyes," Daniel said, "and unlike you, I actually care." One of the administrators, a woman named Lisa Monroe, flipped through the documents, her face paling. This is bad." Marcus scoffed, though the unease in his posture betrayed him. "So what? You think you're going to take this to the press? You'll bury your own company?" Daniel leaned forward. "No, Marcus, I'm going to save it." The door opened and several high-level executives walked in, their expressions grim. Behind them stood two men from the city's oversight committee. Daniel had made a few calls last night, and now, the people who could actually hold Guardian Response accountable were here to listen. Marcus stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You have no authority to—" Daniel pulled off his name badge and slammed his real ID onto the table. "Daniel Grayson, CEO." Marcus paled. The room fell into stunned silence. "Actually," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, "I have all the authority I need." For the first time since stepping undercover, he felt like he had control again. And today Guardian Response was going to start answering for its failures. With Marcus Hale and his corrupt network officially removed, Guardian Response Services was finally in Daniel Grayson's hands. But fixing the company wasn't going to be as simple as firing one man. The rot ran deep. Morale was low, resources were misallocated, and trust between the EMTs and the leadership was shattered. It was time to rebuild. Daniel knew he couldn't fix everything overnight, but he also knew that every second counted. His first order of business? Prioritizing emergency response over politics. He issued an immediate directive eliminating VIP call prioritization. No more pushing emergency cases aside just because a donor wanted faster service. The new rule was simple: emergencies first, no exceptions. Next came staffing and resources. EMTs had been working double shifts without proper breaks, and the exhaustion had cost lives. Daniel implemented an aggressive hiring campaign, bringing in more paramedics and dispatchers to relieve the burden on overworked teams. Pay increases were approved, ensuring that Guardian Response's employees weren't just scraping by, but actually making a living wage. He also restructured the dispatch system. Under Marcus's leadership, ambulances were often redirected based on financial incentives rather than medical necessity. That changed. Daniel brought in an independent oversight committee to monitor response times, ensuring every patient received care based on urgency, not wealth. But policies weren't enough. Daniel needed to regain the trust of his employees. He spent the next several weeks riding in ambulances, working shifts alongside EMTs, experiencing their struggles firsthand. He didn't just give orders from an office, he proved he was one of them. During one of these shifts, he noticed a small but significant change. A veteran EMT, someone who had been skeptical of all corporate leadership, turned to him after a particularly difficult call and said, "It's different now. Feels like we matter again." That was the moment Daniel knew he was on the right path. As weeks passed, the company began to stabilize. Response times improved, patient complaints decreased, the EMTs, once exhausted and demoralized, now worked with renewed purpose. It wasn't perfect, and there was still work to do, but Guardian Response was no longer the failing company he had first stepped into. Daniel stood outside headquarters one evening, watching as an ambulance pulled out, not for a donor, not for profit, but for someone who truly needed it. For the first time in years, Guardian Response was doing what it was meant to do. And Daniel wasn't just running a company anymore, he was leading a mission. Eric Lawson stood at the entrance of Guardian Response Services, gripping the strap of his bag. He had spent years as Marcus Hale's right-hand man, enforcing policies that prioritized profits over people. Now, with Marcus gone and Daniel Grayson in charge, Eric was no longer in a position of power. He had been suspended, investigated, and nearly fired, and yet he had returned. When Daniel saw him, the tension in the room thickened. The EMTs who had once worked under Eric gave him wary glances, their distrust clear. No one had forgotten how he had upheld Marcus's corrupt system, how he had dismissed complaints, how he had looked the other way when emergency calls were ignored. But today, Eric wasn't here to demand his old job back. "I know I don't deserve a second chance," Eric said quietly, "but I want one." Daniel studied him for a long moment. He didn't believe in easy forgiveness. Redemption had to be earned. "If you really want to fix what you broke," Daniel finally said, "then you start from the bottom." That day, Eric put on the uniform, not as a director, not as an executive, but as an EMT. He took orders from the same people he once dismissed, responding to calls without special treatment. The real test came 2 weeks later, when an emergency call came in, a cardiac arrest in a low-income neighborhood, the kind of call he once would have deprioritized. Without hesitation, Eric jumped into the ambulance. This time, he didn't hesitate. He didn't cut corners. He did the job the way it was always meant to be done. And for the first time in years, he felt like he was saving lives, not just protecting profits. Daniel Grayson stood outside Guardian Response Services, watching as ambulances pulled out of the station, their sirens wailing into the distance. It had been months since Marcus Hale's removal, and while the road to recovery hadn't been easy, the company was no longer the broken, corrupt system it once was. Under new leadership, Guardian Response had undergone a complete transformation. Wages had increased, ensuring EMTs weren't forced to work dangerous overtime just to make ends meet. More ambulances were added to underserved areas, eliminating the deadly response delays that had once cost lives. A new dispatch system had been implemented, prioritizing calls based on urgency rather than profitability. Most importantly, a culture shift had taken place, one where every call mattered, every patient was treated with dignity, and no one was left behind. For the first time in years, EMTs walked into work without fear, knowing their efforts were valued. The toxic, fear-driven leadership was gone, replaced with a team that worked together rather than against each other. Even Eric Lawson, once Marcus's enforcer, had proven his commitment to change. Though many still regarded him with skepticism, he had stepped back onto the streets as an EMT, not an executive. He had learned firsthand what it meant to serve the people he once ignored. Redemption wasn't just about saying the right words. It was about proving, day after day, that he had truly changed. Daniel took a deep breath as he stepped back inside. This wasn't just about saving Guardian Response. It was about setting a new standard, one that other emergency service providers could follow. Lives had been lost because of greed, but now, lives were being saved because of integrity. As another call came through the dispatch radio, Daniel knew one thing for certain. Guardian Response Services would never go back to what it once was. It was now a company built on service, not profit, and this time, it would stay that way. The story of Guardian Response Services serves as a powerful reminder that leadership isn't about control, it's about responsibility. When Daniel Grayson went undercover, he didn't just uncover inefficiency, he exposed a system that valued profits over people, where human lives were treated as numbers on a balance sheet. Under Marcus Hale's leadership, EMTs were overworked, patients were left waiting, and employees were too afraid to speak up about the glaring issues that put lives at risk. One of the most profound lessons from this experience is that accountability cannot be ignored. Leadership isn't about protecting the bottom line at all costs. It's about ensuring the people under your care have the resources, respect, and support they need to do their jobs effectively. The EMTs on the ground weren't the problem. It was the toxic leadership that forced them into impossible situations, prioritizing company revenue over response times, and ignoring the very real human consequences of their decisions. Daniel also learned that true change requires action, not just words. Too often, executives rely on data and reports to gauge performance, never bothering to see the reality their employees face. By stepping into the trenches himself, Daniel saw the broken system firsthand, felt the exhaustion of his workers, and witnessed the pain of the people his company had failed. That experience changed him and ultimately changed Guardian Response. But perhaps the most crucial takeaway is that no industry, especially one built on saving lives, should ever put profit over people. Emergency services are not businesses in the traditional sense. They exist to serve the public. When a company loses sight of that, it loses its purpose. Guardian Response had to fall apart to be rebuilt into something better, a company where every EMT, every dispatcher, and every patient mattered. Daniel's journey proves that true leadership isn't about maintaining power. It's about standing up when something is wrong and having the courage to fix it. Because in industries like emergency care, the choices leaders make don't just affect profits. They determine who lives and who dies.